I started working with decisions about over 6 years ago out of Richmond, Virginia. I worked for a small fintech company called WealthForge. And their whole back office process for taking care of investments and investors was done in Excel spreadsheets, which is not uncommon. But it was killing them. And so they came along and they said, hey, can you try this decisions thing? And I advocated against it. I said, we have our own tech team. If we're going to be building something in-house, we should use them. And I said, they're busy. Go learn decisions. I said, fine. A couple years later, they said, you've built everything we need you to build. We want you to stop working with decisions and go do more technical project management. And I said, no. And I called up Heath. I said, can I come work for you? And they said, yes. And so I ended up on the professional services team running projects. After I left Decisions, I started my own consultancy. And my original customer, WealthForge, called me up and said, we still have the project that you started 4 years ago. Can you come work on it some more and build more stuff for us? And I said, sure. So I'm in this weird position of I have started dozens of projects with Decisions Professional Services. I have seen lots and lots of projects for the first 2, 3, 4 months. I've also got one project that I've been working on for 6 years. And it's a vastly different feeling when you're working on new projects and old projects, right? Starting a project is easy. It's just great, right? But once you've got a project that you've been on for a long time, especially when you've had multiple people working on it, Jake has worked on it. Sonali from Decisions has worked on it. We've had an internal developer from WealthForge worked on it. So it's had a bunch of hands in it. So the data types are messy. The graphs and charts are all over the place. I mean, it's tough to go in there and take something that's been around that long and try and work with it. So I want to focus today on the things that I wish I'd kind of known about or done differently when I first started that project. The things that kind of govern the way I think about things. 3 points of philosophy. The first one is software eats the world. This was sort of a seminal essay by Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the big venture capitals out in Silicon Valley. But he knows software really well, and he has this, I wouldn't call it scathing necessarily, but this amazing essay that talks about how software is taking over, and you need to get on board with it. It was sort of prophetic for the time, but he talks about things like when Borders sold its digital music sales to Amazon. Oops, right? There's a famous phrase that says, make change easy, then make the easy change. It's attributed to Kent Beck, but it talks about how to make changes in software, all right? If you reach a point where you're like, customer says, we need it to behave this way, we need to do this thing, and you're like, oh, we can't do that, then you built it wrong, all right? Change should always be possible with software. It's the most important thing that software does. And then my own thing, this is my philosophy coming from General Electric. Your problems are never technical. Your problems are always cultural. If you have the right people, if you chose the right technology, if you retained the right people, you have technical challenges, right? But you'll get over them. You'll be able to handle it, all right? We're not making AI out there because we have dumb people that don't know how to do this stuff. You may not have them, or you may have let them go, or you may have simply chosen the wrong tech stack. But I promise you, if you get those things right, if you get the cultural things right, the technical things will follow. In short, if you're leading a company or leading a team, culture is more important than technology. The technology will follow from that. Those are my 3 points of philosophy. We're going to focus on the middle one, all right? Change is the most important thing that software does. I'm going to do that by kind of going through these things here. First one, know your data types. We're going to spend a fair bit of time on that. We'll be contrasting the data types that Decisions has. Decisions is unusual compared to other low-code technologies because it's not just about data structure. We have things like entities and case entities and folders and stuff like that other low-code things don't have. We'll talk about Mongoizing your SQL database. For those of you that know about Mongo, I'll show you a little bit how to do that within Decisions. I'm not talking about connecting to a Mongo database. I'm talking about using SQL to make JSON-shaped data in your Decisions database. Very briefly on assignments, I might skip that. Then last one will be understand your customer, and this will be more for architects and TPMs. But you've probably attended a number of sessions today where people have talked about getting to know your customer and finding out what they want and really getting in there. And those are all great phrases, but they don't give you actual techniques, questions to ask, things to do to extract that information from your customer's mind, all right? Oftentimes we end up, especially in professional services, we don't know a thing about investments or car loans or mortgages or something. We're called in to help build a process. And we have these people, these customers, who are describing their process in what my friend calls meat space. That's humans walking around in their meat suits and vibrating air at each other. We derive so much information from context when we talk to people that doesn't exist in the system. It doesn't exist in a computer. And getting that out of your customer's head is hard. And so I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to try and do that. If we have time, we'll get to the three things that business software needs. It's a little bit more philosophy. I don't know if we'll get there. I'm going to be asking you guys questions, not rhetorical questions. I want the audience to answer some of these questions. And I want you guys to stop me at any point and ask questions if you are having trouble following along or just want to know more about anything I'm talking about. Okay? When you go to the decisions documentation, and you go to the section on data types, you're going to see this chart here. I had no idea what this meant when I first saw it. Like first day of decisions trainings, they're like, look at this. And as a new person, it doesn't mean anything. Like you have no idea what's going on here. The important thing is here, not as complex on this side, reasonably more complex over here. Also, less impact on performance, greater impact on performance. So to highlight these differences, we're going to be talking about these two data types. The first one, I know it's hard to see, but the first one on the left is just a simple data structure. If you're a traditional developer, like this is just saving a record to a database. That's all it does. The one on the right is called a case entity. And this is a decisions data type that incorporates saving data to the database, but also incorporating process tracking along with it, auditing along with it, and folder structure. So you can save your case entities inside folders for easy viewing. All right? So it does a lot. Here's how I think about these two things. The database structure on the left-hand side is lighter, and the case entity is much heavier. And we'll kind of go into a little bit of detail about what that means. The database structure is less value in the portal. That is to say, if you're using the decisions like Blue Portal, right? You give somebody access, they can come into that. You're not going to be able to see those things. Or somebody's going to have to build some sort of UI for you to be able to see those records. But like with the case entity, if you're in the portal, you can open it right up and look at it. And I'll show you that here in a minute. Database structures are less complex. And the database structures are more flexible. Now, the case entities definitely have some advantages to them. But the reason I harp on this flexibility thing, is because for me, the most important thing that software does is change. And you're going to find that change is easier with the smaller structures. And I'll give you some examples of how that works. That isn't to say don't use case entities. All right? They're great for a lot of things. But I want you to know going into it what some of the drawbacks are or what some of the things you might be sacrificing if you choose to use this data structure. All right? I'll be using two customer examples for as we go through these data types. The first one is a tax preparer. Worked on a project for a major tax preparer for the United States, and the project was called WOTC, stands for Work Opportunity Tax Credit. It's where companies that hire people like veterans or people on food stamps can get some sort of tax credit for making those hires. The person's hired and they work for 3 months or more, you can get a tax credit for that, right? And there's rules about how much you get, all that kind of thing. On the 1st and the 15th of every month, this tax preparer would get tens of thousands of records all at once. And they'd all have to go through this system that we built, right? And for that kind of thing, we wanted something as lightweight as possible. Then we had a customer that was a patent law office. I don't know if you worked on that one or not, but this was a company, this was a law office that filed patents for people. And they might do, a couple hundred at most patents per year. And the process was a very well-known linear process within the office that they could have controlled and established themselves. And it was a perfect case for case entity because they knew what the process was going to be and they had control over everything. Out of the box, case entities are really easy to use, right? They're I don't want to say seductive, but as a new developer, you might gravitate towards them and say, like, I get it, this makes so much sense. But they come with a cost. We'll do some back-end comparisons, and I want to point out performance. In this chart, we talk about performance impact is having much more performance impact on case entity. It used to be that case entities, if you had 40,000, 60,000, something like that, and you wanted to put it into a report, it was slow. It's not like that anymore. I went in and tried to prove it with version 8, installed 8 on here, and it's much, much better. I've got 3 million case entities on this computer, and they fire right up. So when it comes to performance, I don't dissuade you from using case entities at all anymore. I used to, but now, go nuts. If you got millions of case entities, it's not going to be a problem. All right? Performance has been greatly increased. All right. So I I'm not a PowerPoint speaker that much. We're going to go into the tool. The first one we're going to look at, we're going to make a comparison between database structures and case entities. The database structure is very simple. I've got last name and first name. That's all I really care about. And for this particular thing, I'm going to say state. And what I mean by state is like, what status is this particular record in, for example? And when I compare that, this is the simple structure, to a case entity, I'll say first name, last name. I got those recorded here. State is missing. Why isn't state here? It's part of the structure, exactly. So come back out here, and we got my little data types folder, and here's my database structures. That's the one we were looking at before. That's the simple one. Case entity has 2 folders underneath it. All right? One is for storage. If I click on this, it's going to bring up all my case entities. And this is what I was talking about before, meaning that in the portal, you can see your case entities. And so as a new person, I would create a case entity. I'd be like, there it is. It's awesome, right? If I want to see a database structure, I have to go build a flow with some sort of UI on it to bring it up, all right? It's not hard to do, but as a new person, this seems, like I say, kind of seductive. The other thing is I can come in here and I can say, case entities govern some sort of process. Everything that comes in that starts as a case entity starts here at started. And then I can say there's in progress and then there's completed. And I can have as many steps as I want in here to govern what happens to my case entity as it moves through this process, all right? I can even add activities. I can come in here and say append first name. And this is just a thing that if you right-click on it, it'll add A+ to the name. So that if I'm looking at my case entity, let's go. If I'm looking here, I can append first name. And it's going to add to it. Oh, it's filtered. But I'm going to add it, and somewhere in here is an atom with an A+ added to it. All right? And so I can add these actions to it, and I can do everything I want. And that's great. Now, reasonably, I can do the same thing here with my defined data structures. It just takes a little bit more work up front. If I come to my page, and I say View, Show Page in New Window, it looks exactly the same when it loads up. Oh, this one's not filtered at all. But yeah, you can come in here, and if I wanted to, I could add, I could right-click and add actions to that as well. So they look very much the same here. One thing I'll point out is that if you're in the, let's go back. If you're in the portal, right? If you're using this view, if your users are logging in and seeing this, all right, then they can use things like these folders and move in and out and find data that way. Most of the companies I've worked with didn't want their users in this portal. Most of them wanted some sort of white glove treatment, right, or white label treatment. They wanted their users to log in and for it to say Supercorp or Awesome Incorporated or whatever and look like their own thing. They wanted their own colors and their own branding and that sort of thing, which takes you out of the portal. And if you're not in the portal, things like case entities and even assignments to some degree lose a lot of their impact. They're designed to work in here. If you end up having to custom make your own page, there's less advantage, all right? Does that make sense? Okay. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here with case entities. One of the things I want to point out, if I go to, actually, let's start with database structure, and I'll say, this is right flow. What are the 2 fields in my simple database structure? First name and last name, right? Well, sorry, and 3, and state, right? There they are. The only other field that got added to this was the ID of the record, the ID of my database. This data structure only has those things I asked for, first name, last name, state. Let's go to the case entity. All right. It has many more. It's got first name and last name, which is what I told it to be in there. But it's also got all this stuff. All right? And these are extra fields that it needs for governing the process. Now, at this stage, it's no big deal. When you're starting the project and you say, add a field, it's no big deal, right? there's nothing to it. 6 years down the line, when this table has grown and grown and grown, and you've got 40 to 50 fields in there, this stuff starts to get annoying. It's not too bad, but it's like, this isn't stuff I asked for, and it's just there, and when I'm debugging, I've got this huge thing in front of me with all these fields that I put in on my own, some of which I regret, and now I've got this extra stuff. That sucks. Not too bad. It's not too bad. Let's look at when we map stuff. The entity results coming out of this. I'm going to grab the first one. These are all the fields that you can map for a case entity. Case ID, the extended folder, custom description, deleted, deleted by, deleted on, entity ID, extension ID, folder full path. Down here are the two fields that I actually care about. All right? Now think about a couple of years from now, I've been working on this thing for a while. I've got a bunch of these things mapped out with a whole bunch of the fields I do care about, plus all these fields that I may not care about really, and I have to pass this project off to someone else. And they have to come in here and make sense of this, and there's tons of extra fields that they don't really understand or get. If they're an experienced person with this business who's been using case entities for a while, over time they'll start to recognize this stuff, and they'll be like, I can filter that out, I don't want that. But it does make things a little bit more complex, all right? And that complexity aggregates over time. Now, I wouldn't steer anyone away from using case entities for these reasons. I'm just letting you know that it adds to it, all right? In the future, like you've got reasonably heavy stuff, and this makes it tougher. But I do want to steer you away for another reason. So we're going to make a flow for a restaurant. I'm using a restaurant because it's something that we've all done and can probably reasonably think of together. Here's my case entity. First step is greet and seat. This is the first stage that can be in. This can come in, and it's going to put a timestamp on when the person came in and who the host was that greeted them. Then we're going to take the order. At this one, it'll stamp when the order was taken and who the server was. Then we have the cook process. Then we have the serve, when the table was served their food. And then last step in the process is paid, okay? The things that we're collecting, the data that we're collecting here are server ID, table ID, host ID, the total, and the orders. And this is a list of smaller data types just called orders. They got a few things in them like what was the menu ID number, what were any special instructions, that kind of thing, all right? And it's a list so you can have multiples in there. So this overall, this is called the table order. And it contains a series of smaller, like, what did each kind of person order? What's the problem here? What would you change? It's a complex data type. It can be used. Let me do this here. Create order. We're going to come here, we're going to create one real quick. And I'll just do it in the debugger. Comes up, host ID. I'm going to say me, the server ID. I'm the host and the waiter. Table ID was 1, 2, 3. And presumably you wouldn't actually type this stuff in. This is stuff that we just connect by database in the background. But the total for this one was $20. One of the orders was fish, and that was 10. And it was cook the fish. At another order, we'll say chicken, and it was $10, and we'll say cook it, and goes through, and it gets saved. And then when we come to the order folder, I think this is the one we just made. Oops. I still can't get used to that in 8, right? And so here it is, right? It's recorded here, and you can click on it. You can say view order, and it brings it back up. Easy. It does everything for you, right? So this is our process. Let's imagine that it's early 2020, all right? And you've just received this order that you can't have anybody in your restaurant anymore, all right? It's been a couple weeks, and now that order has not been lifted, but the government's now saying you can do takeout orders, all right, to include things like DoorDash and Grubhub, all right? Your whole process is here, and importantly, your order information is stored inside of this. How do you adapt now? Any ideas? Go for it.
You have to add some new fields on there, or maybe take off table ID since that was physically present in the restaurant.
Yeah, there's really kind of two ways to approach this. One, you could add several new steps in here. You could have a step in here called API call, such that when Grubhub sends you information, like that step would say, this is the point of the process where I receive information from the outside. You might have to have a step in here called pickup, meaning when the customer showed up to pick up the food. But this process right here, going back and forth, this could become pretty nasty, right? Because you're trying to take three processes and glom them into one. Alternatively, you could create two other case entities, right? You could create a separate process for Grubhub that starts with API, and then food is cooked, and then last step might be food is picked up. You might create another process for takeout food, all right, which is phone in. Somebody called in, and then you may or may not run the credit card when they phone in, and then when they arrive to pick up the food, all right? So you got three different processes now. Here's the challenge. Imagine that you're the owner of the restaurant, or you're the manager of the restaurant, and for a while you've had this really pretty view where you had a dashboard and it said, here's all my orders, here's the state of all those orders, and I can see everything that's going on. Now you have three different processes, and they don't jive. They don't necessarily play well together. You would need three different dashboards. One that says, here's the dine-in process, and where all those things are sitting. Here's the call-in process, and where all those things are sitting. And here's the Grubhub process, and where all those things are sitting, all right? And you have to, because case entities, you can't just glom them together, all right? In this case, what we've done with case entities is we've merged process with data. And we've said they're kind of the same thing. And I'm telling you, they're not. And that can get you into trouble, all right? Questions on that? All right. So if we were to do this using simple data structures, all right, imagine that we've got a main table here called orders. And that's got things like the table, not the table, the order total, the type of process that this was, whether it was dine-in or phone-in or Grubhub or something like that, when the order was placed and when the order was completed. Because we want those timestamps there, because regardless of how it comes into us, those are two timestamps that are always there. They're always consistent for every order. And lastly, we have paid as a Boolean on this one. Where did we put paid before? Do you remember? In the original process, paid was at the very end. When you were sitting at a table, you said, oh, at the very end, the person paid. It's the last step in the process. You said that's a process step. But it's not a process step when it comes to Grubhub. When it comes to like Grubhub, it may be paid before you receive it. All right? By the time that API hits you, it's already paid. All right? What about if they phone in? They phone in, they may read their credit card number to you over the phone, and it may be paid, or it may not be paid until they get there. So paid isn't a process point when it comes to like the original process. You got to find some other way to say, is this paid or not? Now what we've done is we've broken out. We said, here are the data points we care about if it's a dine-in process. Here's the data points we care about if it's a takeout process. And here's the data points we care about if it's a Grubhub process, right? But we've broken those out. And I think it's really important to sort of tease those apart, break those apart, because we treat these things quite differently, all right? And if you go with a case entity, you're stuck on a very well-defined narrow path, all right, that doesn't offer a lot of change, or more importantly, kind of forking into other processes. Does that make sense? So another one I want to talk about is that tax preparer, right? We had the WOTC process. Here are all the steps that need to happen. A record comes in, somebody's employment record, and we say, have they been employed at Walmart for more than 3 months? Are they a disabled vet, or were they receiving food stamps? If all these things are true, then we say, oh, their employment now is worth some tax credit to the employer. That's the WOTC process, all right? And we can keep track of all the things that we care about in the WOTC process. Additionally, if that, say, disabled vet lives in Texas, Texas has a process that gets you a discount, all right? These are two processes that could be going at the same time with relation to the same employment record. You're not going to be able to do that with case entities, but you can do that here because we've separated out the data we care about from the process. Does that make sense? Okay. This is the point where I want to talk about the three different types of tables, all right? The first type of table is table with, it sounds generic to say this, but with data, like the stuff you care about. So a personnel table might have somebody's name, their social security number, where they live, stuff like that, like data. Then there's tables that govern processes, right? A table that says, like, we received the file at this point, it was transferred to this location, here's where it sits now. That process may have its own status, right? But it governs kind of like the movement of data through a workflow. When you use a case entity, it does that all on back end for you. It says, we know that you care about workflows, and so we're gonna make it really easy for you. But it's just, you can do it with these, just make your own table that governs the workflow. So data, process, and lastly, relationships, all right? What do I mean when I say a table that governs relationships? There are three kinds of relationships: one-to-one, one-to-many, and what else? And how do you handle those? If you have a many-to-many relationship, so imagine that I have chairs, right? And so each one of these chairs is a line in the table. It would say, owner is Terry. And so if you did a search for my ID, all these chairs would come up. But if you were to say, this chair is owned by Terry, but it's also owned by Jake and Josiah, all right? That's a many-to-many relationship. So I got this example here. On the left-hand side, we have a table. And this record is Josh, he's an owner. And that's Terry, and he's an owner. On this side, we have cars. My little Acura Integra, my Mazda Speed, my GTI, right? And these all contain data, right? Data about the owners, data about the cars. Terry owned the Acura Integra at one point. Josh owned the Acura Integra at one point as well. He also owned the VW GTI, and he also owned the Mazda Speed. And we use these intermediary tables to broker those many-to-many relationships. Oftentimes, these tables just contain things like car ID and owner ID, and they just connect these two sides. But in this case, you can see I also put owned from and owned to, so that this car, which was owned by two different people at different times, can be recorded. If I come up and say, in 2011, what car did Josh have? It might pull up this record and this record, because he could own two cars at the same time. And you can't do that if you say, Josh, car ID is this. If there's one field there to put Josh's car ID, Josh's limited to one car then. But if you use these tables in between to broker the relationship, all right, you can make it as big as you want, all right? And it's very elegant. It's a good way to handle things. The reason I bring this up is because when you're talking to customers, I want you to be thinking about what kind of table are we talking about here? Are we talking about recording data? Are we talking about brokering relationships? Or are we talking about process? And this is hard to do because, well, first off, any questions, any thoughts so far? Customers are going to come to you at some point and say, when an employment record comes in, we need to know who it is and whether or not they're in our system already. And if they are, we need to check how long they've been employed at their employer. If they've been employed for more than 3 months, then they're eligible for WOTC benefits. But we have to check their WOTC record to see how much they've received already, because the benefits decline over time. Also, if they're a disabled vet in Texas, we need to take that and put it through the Texas process. And that's a little bit tricky. That's something that Donna handles, but we can talk to her about it. And Texas has a limited amount of money that they give out for this. All right? It's complex, and in that description, the customer just described to me both relationships, processes, and data that need to be retained. And in their mind, it's all sort of together. And it's your job to tease that stuff apart and put those into separate tables and understand what those tables are for. Does that make sense? All right, any questions? Quiet class, we might get through this. All right. This is from Carl Hewitt, the guy who started Decisions. I point this out because these things like case entities look great at first, and they do work the way they're supposed to. I don't have anything against them, but I don't want you to use them just because they make things fast or easy. That's not the appropriate reason to use them. All right. Use them if you really, really know your process, you know it can't change, you know that it's solid, and you kind of control it. That's fine. But if you don't know, or if you think that you're in a field where things could change in the future, Use something that's more flexible, because change is the most important thing that software does. All right? Talk a little bit about how to Mongoize. Who here has worked with Mongo? Anybody know what Mongo is? Okay. I started studying Mongo, kind of learning how to use it when a buddy of mine, I was years into this project for WealthForge, and I was complaining about it, and he said, like, oh yeah, you're using a relational database, you're in relationship hell. And I went back to my Lucid chart, and I looked at all my tables with all the lines connecting everything, and it was relationship hell, all right? It's not that way at the start. At the start, everything's neat and clean, and you're happy, right? But years on, after several people have put their hands on the project, you have tables all over the place with lots of complex relationships, and it's hard as hell to manage. And one of the things that Mongo does is it stores things in kind of a JSON format with, like, tiers of information. And you can do that in decisions, even using SQL, which is weird. Nobody else does this. But as you can see here, I've got an investment, all right? And for my investment, I have the interest rate, I have the investment amount, and I have a thing called investor. But my investor is not a string or a decimal or a Boolean or a date timestamp. It's another complex object called investor. So investor is subordinate to investment. And inside of investor, I have address. An address is a shape subordinate to the investor. And when you run it in the debugger, it looks like this. My investment is up there. It's got the ID. It's got the interest rate, got the amount. Investment. This is tied to investment. And then here's the investor. I've got the bank and my name. And then I've also got my address subordinate to that. You can store things in decisions this way. Now, Decisions doesn't really talk about this or even recommend it, because SQL purists will tell you, no, you should keep very clean tables separated, joined by IDs. And when I first started working at WealthForge, I didn't know that. I was just a novice. I didn't know what I was doing. But I noticed that you could do this, and I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And I built our fundamental data structures using this. And a year later, I was like, man, that was so stupid. I can't believe I did that. But they were so fundamental, I couldn't really change them. We never went back or fixed it or anything. And I got to tell you, 6 years on, they're working great. I don't know why we don't talk about this, but it works. All right, you can store data this way. The drawback to this, let me go here. Okay, so the drawback to this, if I think I have nothing in it yet. Okay, I've got one record here now. I'm going to go in. I'm going to say all other I run this. So investment has this ID that it generates for the database. It's got the investment amount, and it's got the interest rate. And then it's got this gobbledygook, like just this random hodgepodge of, because SQL is storing a complex object. And so when you put it in there, it kind of messes up, right? But there's this extra thing here that tells it, hey, decisions, when you see this, use this structure. It takes this gobbledygook, puts it into that structure in decisions, and decodes it, and you can see it. It's fast and effective, all right? If you were to have another system that was querying your decisions database directly, it would not be able to make heads or tails of investor. That would not work, all right? But if you were to do like an API query, if somebody were to say, hey, I'm going to send you an API query and hit your decisions instance, it actually makes things easier because, let's see, is this it? Yeah. All right. If you were to fetch an investment record, it's going to look like this, which is what I showed before, right? And for most API queries, that's what you want, right? It's already in JSON format. You're going to be sending it to your customers or to your users in a format that's highly legible. We've got a customer that a customer for WealthForge that came to us and said, we want to send you a bunch of investment data, and then we want to be able to query it to see what state it's in. And it was easy for us because we just said, do you have a structure in mind? And they said, no. And I just said, well, here's my structure. And they said, no problem. And now I don't have to go and grab a record from this table and this table and this table and this table and try and bring them all together and then put them into some sort of JSON structure for my API query. I just query this directly and it works. So that's an option for you. All right, go for it.
Where do you go to set up Mongo in decision? Is it something that's external or internal?
It's internal, and and we'll be careful with the nomenclature here. We're not setting up Mongo. We're not using Mongo at all. Decisions has some Mongo integrations. I've never played with them. What I'm saying is you can come in here and you can say, here are my simple data structures. The first one is address, and if I say edit data structure, here are the 3 fields for my address. And once address is created, I can go to investor, and I can say bank, name, and then I just stick address, which I just created, in here. I select it as my type. So instead of selecting like string or decimal or integer or something like that, you can select another whole object and structure it that way. All right? My gut feels like I should be warning you away from this. I should be telling you that this is not how it's supposed to be. But I'm telling you, I've used it for years now, and it's performed flawlessly. So if you've got a lot of complexity, this really simplifies things. Yes?
How does that handle changes to the complex data types? So if like your investor changes over time and remove fields, how does that get handled with existing data?
I don't know, but I don't imagine it would be any different than any other change in the database. So for instance, I have changed things like an address, right? You come in and added a field to it, and if it's an add, it's no problem, it just adds it, right? I generally don't take fields away because I'm scared about what the ramifications might be, right? So if you're adding, not a worry. If you're taking away, do some testing first, all right? But I mean, that's true of anything. That's not specific to this, right? Okay, yeah.
What makes this data structure unique, Mongo-wise versus just a JSON structure?
Decisions doesn't store JSON natively. Like decisions, like if you have a structure, like a JSON structure coming through from somebody else's API, you're going to have to map each one of those fields to where you want it to be in your decisions database, and that's probably spread across several tables. One of the things I like about this, I'm glad you asked that, because one of the things I like about this is if I do create investment, okay, I've got 3 tables. You guys just saw. I have the address table, the investor table, and the investment table. I've got 3 records I want to save. If I come here and I debug, investment amount will say 2,000, and the interest rate is 1.5, and the investor is me, and the bank is bank, and the street is AS, and the city is Knoxville. The state is Tennessee. I hit that. I have one stop here called create investment. In that one stop, it saved all of this. If we come back out, let me refresh the whole thing. There's my new record. It's saved in all 3 tables. Those structures that were subordinate to the main one, saved in all places. All right? Now, there's a change in 8. You used to be able to come in and say, GUID, get GUID, create a unique ID right here. And then you could insert that GUID into the ID for the investment and the reference ID in the investor. You can't do that now, all right, because they've improved, actually, the way IDs work in decisions. But if you needed to, what I created here was a step where you create the investment, then you go fetch the investment, get the ID from that investment, and insert that investment into the investor. And what that does is maintain your SQL relationships between tables. That way you kind of get the best of both worlds. You both have a Mongo database structure served as your investment, but if you go to your investor table, it's going to have the ID of the investment that it relates to. So you can still make joins and queries and all that kind of thing. Everybody tracking? Questions? We go until when?
So in your example on the restaurant,
Yeah.
so you start with a simple data structure, right?
Okay.
Customer comes in and signs a credit card receipt.
And say it again, if you're.
Sometimes going with a simple structure might not be the best idea, like maybe you need to anticipate that you might need a folder extension.
I would argue that the simple structure is always the best idea, only because you can make it as complex as you want, right? If you need extra data associated with that simple database structure, you can create it, all right? But when you go down the path of like you said, put it in a folder, right? We've had instances where we put data in folders and said that's a really convenient way to store things. We totally get it, and then somebody came along and said like, we had an example where we had assignments that were stored in folders, and it was for a medical facility that had tasks that everybody had to do. They had to clean the hood, and we had to sterilize the needles and these kinds of things. And those assignments were based on the location in the hospital. So like the clean room 1 had all these assignments, and then the pharmacy 2 had all these assignments. And then they came and said like, oh, assignments can also belong to people. Well, we were storing our assignments in folders, and now we needed to have a many-to-many relationship. And that became kind of a problem, right? And so I'm not opposed to folders, but you've got to know for sure that it's a one-to-one relationship. And like I said, the most important thing software does is change, and your customers, they don't always know how it's going to change. Is it really noon? Okay. I'm going to keep you all just a little bit longer than anyway. We'll skip assignments. Let's go to this one. Okay, when you're talking with your customer, it's not combat, but you really need to challenge them. They don't understand their processes as well as they think they do, or at least much of their understanding comes from context, and you've got to extract that context from them. So when you're sitting there and starting to talk about how things work, I love to bring up tables in front of them and say, this is how I'm thinking about storing things. You don't have to be a database expert, but let me ask you some questions about all the things that we're going to record for you. Ask dumb and redundant questions, all right? They're going to say like, yeah, a person comes in and gives us their credit card number, and then we run it. And I'll be like, okay, so like you run it on a machine, or how do you run it? I know how they run it. I want them to tell me, all right? Because you're going to be surprised sometimes. They're going to say like, oh, there's actually three processes we can use for credit cards. We can run it using our credit card machine. We can run it online. We also have one of those old school things, all right? And you're like, oh, I didn't think of that, but I needed to know that. And so asking those dumb questions helps bring that out. Intentionally ask incorrect questions, all right? Sit down and say, all right, Deborah, now you said that the name of the task will be like some mix of like the folder name and the date. And Deborah's like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. I meant this, all right? Have her clarify, especially if you can get him or her to clarify in front of other people on the team, all right? This kind of brings us to the next one. Ask different users to define the same field. This is one of my favorite things to do. If you can get multiple people on the phone at once and say, okay, so when it comes through, it's going to hit this part of the process, and it finishes when it gets here. Texas will pay out this tax benefit on this condition every single time. And first person says yes, the next person says yes, and the third person says yes, and the fourth person says, well, and that's where you know you've hit gold, okay? Because there's an exception there, one that you need to account for, all right? You were about to make a one-to-many relationship, and it turns out it's many-to-many, and you find out because that person just brought up, it's like, well, and it's always followed by this phrase, this hardly ever happens, but, all right, listen for that, dig for that, find those things, all right? Yeah, and then lastly, ask questions in the extreme. All right, you want things like, this can never happen, or this must always happen, or you can't progress to this part of the process without passing through this part first, right? And get that confirmation from different people. Going back to this part, when I first started working with WealthForge, they said, we need to be able to record our client's information. And so I said, no problem. And I just went with what they told me. Client. Client has a name, an address, and a CRD number that's issued to them from the regulating authority. And so I had my client thing. I was all ready to go. And I started talking to Colby, who's on investment due diligence, and he said, oh yeah, we got all the selling groups have to be verified for this. So I created the selling group. And I talked to Racy, and she says like, oh, you have a bunch of sponsors that we need to verify. I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the fields between these things were similar. It turns out selling groups are a client, and sponsors are a client. And I've got this extra thing now where I started going through the database, and I saw like WarTech was there as a client and it was here as a selling group. I was like, why is it in both places? And they're like, well, we filled it out in both places because you told us to. I was like, I didn't. WarTech should be one thing. But I didn't know that because different parts of the company were using the term client to mean different things. So go in there, and when someone says anything generic like customer or client, be like, let's be more specific. What's a customer? What's a client? Do you have different types? What are they? All right. Dig for those questions. All right. Otherwise, you're going to be making superfluous tables. You'll be making redundant extra stuff. So if you have client and sponsors, that kind of thing, are you better off having one table that says it's either sponsor or client as a type, or are you better off making sponsor and selling group their own tables? All right. Beth, you say client. All right. Who says this one? All right. Any other votes? Here?
The single client table within a type table relationship. I think it has to be more than.
You could do that, yeah. Generally speaking, I would push you towards this, all right? Because change is the most important thing. What's going to happen, and what happened to me was after they said, yep, these are the fields that we need. This is what we care about. This is what we care about. 3 years later, they come and say, we have a whole bunch of stuff regarding selling groups that we need to record, all right? We're doing the diligence on when they've had their last training, when they've been certified with FINRA, all this extra stuff, all right? Those fields that we care about for selling group, they're not relevant to sponsor. So for this one, I can add to it. I can grow it as much as I want, and that's fine without affecting other tables. Another thing I'd caution you about is generic things like client are tricky because we eventually started having deals that would come through, and we recorded the selling group for something, and that selling group wasn't necessarily our client. That selling group was involved in the transaction of some investment, but they didn't pay us for anything. So just because we record this information doesn't necessarily mean that they're a client. Make sense? Okay. I have a bunch more stuff, and we don't have time to go over it. Thank you all for coming very much, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.